Hi, Peter.
Hi there. Hi, Connie.
So Peter, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So about this, is it possible to make me a co-host of the meeting?
Oh, yes, we had talked about that before. Yes, we can do that.
Great.
It is done.
Okay.
How are you doing, Connie? You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, yes, things are going fairly well. Just hanging in there.
Good.
Hey, I was going to ask you something totally unrelated to today, but I'm doing some GIS stuff for one of my classes. And are you aware that American Fact Finder is no more? That's where I used to go. I used to go for GIS data all the time, and apparently it's been taken down, and censusdata.gov is in charge of it, and you can't get any historical data for a lot of things before 2000. Because I was trying to
check IPUMS. IPUMS.
Okay. Because when I sent them an email message, and they basically are saying that they're debating if they're going to put the historical data back up like American Fact Finder had it, which kind of bothers me because I'm trying to get
IPUMS. When you go to the IPUMS website, look for the NHGIS, which stands for National Historical GIS. They have everything since 1790.
Okay, and it's spelled again, IPUMS?
IPUMS.
IPUMS. Okay, thank you. It's a good thing I asked because I thought, what do you didn't like the sound that they took all the historical stuff away. So
yeah.
Okay.
So hi, Rachel Tarbett. I'm glad you're able to make it. And Anne and Christian, what's your surname?
Enriquez.
Nice to have you here. Thank you for coming. Marone and I are going to be trying to sort of keep an eye on people coming into the room. How did that work for you last time, Marone? Did you just chat with people in the waiting room and stuff like that?
I tried to, but people weren't responding. And,
I see.
sometimes people join with their iPads or something like that, and it just says iPad or
I see.
Samsung Galaxy or something like that. So I try to message them to get their full name, but
yeah, I decided not to go through any kind of full registration process just because you know, I didn't want to make it any more cumbersome than it really needed to be. I mean, I haven't had personally any problems with this. So maybe our best approach is just to be vigilant, and if someone starts trying to disrupt the meeting, we can boot them.
Yeah.
Hopefully it won't be a problem.
We can just kick it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
So I'm just going to, we're supposed to start at 3:30, and Gregory Simon is slated to be the first speaker. We might give it a couple of minutes just to enable people to show up a minute or two late.
Okay.
Hi, Brian.
Hello. Sorry, I was getting something to drink. Hang on.
Oh, no problem.
There we go. Hey.
How's it going?
It's good. Happy Friday, everybody.
Yeah, happy May Day.
That's right. May 1.
Workers of the World Unite Day.
Is it like a Labor Day? Is that what they call
Yeah,
it?
it's a, I don't know the history of it. I probably should, but it's a big deal in socialist countries.
It's good to see everybody.
Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Chris. And Brianna, thank you for coming. And Amy.
Hi.
Hi there. Has anyone seen Gregory Simon recently?
Not since last Friday.
Oh, okay.
What about Amanda? Is she goes second?
Yeah, she should be here too.
Okay, there's Gregory.
Oh, brilliant. Hi, Gregory.
Hi.
So I was just saying, I think we'll give it 2 or 3 minutes just to kind of let people filter through, and then we'll get started right away so that we can be efficient. I will, if you can see me, well, what I can do, there's Amanda.
There
So
we go.
we're all there. I'll just kind of leave it to you to keep track of the time. We'll try to keep it reasonably strictly to 10 minutes just to make sure that we leave plenty of time for discussion.
I like the idea of reasonably strictly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if we go a few minutes over, that's fine.
Hey, not fair. Kathy and I practiced this morning to get it down. Seriously, I was so proud. I spent all day practicing.
Brilliant. And I would like to record this, assuming that no one objects. Will, one of the reasons that we would like to is to kind of share it with the See You Succeed instructors who are looking for stuff to share with their class. If you object to that, send me a text message and I'll excise your component.
Okay.
Because I can do
Sounds
video
good.
editing now thanks to COVID.
Could I make a request, Peter?
Sure.
Would someone mind actually maybe telling us when we have a 10-minute mark and a 2-minute mark?
Well, your 10-minute mark will be the second that you begin.
Okay.
And I will happily, in fact, that's a good idea. If you can pay attention, I tend to do this kind of symbol, you know, for my class, but I'll text you at 2 minutes out, and I'll keep track of the time.
Okay, so I came in just short of that. So we are being true to 10 minutes?
Yes.
Or is it 10 to 15?
10 minutes, please.
Okay.
And the main reason is I don't want us to, the bulk of this time really should be in discussion.
Okay.
I want everyone to participate. And so I think I'll go ahead and get started so that we can sort of remain true to that. First of all, welcome and thank you all very much for coming. This was an idea that we had at one of the faculty meetings. This would be the second one sort of panel that we've run. There may be 1 or 2 anthropologists or others among you, and welcome to the geography department. The idea originally was we had to cancel a bunch of our colloquia, and we wanted to make sure that we kind of maintain some sense of community and scholarly engagement. So the structure of this is such that we've got 4 presenters today. We'll start with Gregory Simon, who's presenting on policy. Then we'll talk, Amanda Weaver will talk about food supply, and then Ann Chin and Kelsey will talk about COVID-19 and what it means for the Anthropocene. So I'm going to give each speaker 10 minutes to present. They'll take the screen at that time. So if you have slides, please feel free to share it. I'd like to encourage everyone to note questions. Again, the idea of this is to have kind of a vibrant discussion following the presentations, but I will ask you to hold off on your questions until all the speakers have completed their time. So once again, welcome. Thank you all so very much for coming. And with that, I'm going to hand it to my first speaker. Let me see if I can. Yes, I'm going to. It is recording. That's great. I'm going to hand it to my first speaker, Gregory Simon, whose presentation is entitled, "If You Can't Stop It, You Can't Stop It If You Can't See It, The Politics of Uncertainty During the COVID-19 Pandemic." And so,
All right.
there you go.
Okay, well, so I begin with the caveat that I'm not an expert on the coronavirus, but I'm going to bring some of the research that I've been doing in other topics to bear on this topic. So this really is meant to be a conversation starter on my presentation. So I hope after all 3 presentations, we have a chance to talk about this. Some of the concepts and ideas I bring up more directly or again. The second is that I was originally going to give this talk a couple of weeks ago, but I was in a thesis defense. And so some of the charts in my presentation end, I have a couple charts and they end around April 10th or so. And that's because the charts were going to be used in the previous presentation. I haven't had a chance to change them, but the data still is relevant and meaningful. And then the third point is I think this times out at around 11 minutes. So I hope that's okay. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with everybody. Okay, I think I want this one. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to jump into it and get moving here. All right, so the inspiration for this talk actually comes from a themed issue that I'm putting together in the journal Geoforum. And the themed issue is entitled Uncertainty and Not Knowing in Environmental Decision Making. This is with a colleague of mine at Penn State University. And the purpose of this special or themed issue is to supplement what is already a strong tradition in geography on the production of environmental knowledge. So what do we know? How do we know it? And to think about the inverse process, the production of environmental knowledge, obfuscation, incertitude, and disregard. In other words, why is it that we don't know certain information? So this research really focuses on the area of agnotology, which is the study of ignorance, the study of not knowing. So what I want to do now is just very briefly spend a minute or so talking about different ways of not knowing. So we may not know something because the data we would need is imperceptible, right? Information we can't detect and don't know. So an example of this might be the COVID-19 virus when it was still in bats, right? Somewhere in a jungle somewhere, we didn't know it existed. It was imperceptible to us. So in that way, we didn't know COVID-19. Another way in which we may not know something is if the data we need to know it is hidden from us, right? So intentional data suppression or redaction. And so an example of this might be the recent decision in the state of Florida to disallow coroners from reporting on COVID-19 deaths, therefore suppressing the COVID case numbers and the death numbers. There have also been some concerns about the countries like China or Russia who may be suppressing information on the number of COVID-19 cases there as well. Another way we could not know or understand something would be that the results from a study are uncertain. And so we always have to ask ourselves, how are we testing and modeling something? And what can and what cannot those tests, or what can't those test results tell us, right? So there may be levels of uncertainty in the findings, and so we have some idea, but there's just some information we still don't know because of inconclusive data. So there are many, many other ways in which we come to not know something, but the type of knowledge I want to talk about here is what I am calling pernicious known unknowns. So the idea of a known unknown is that it's something we know we don't know. So the known there is that we know that we don't know something. That's what a known unknown is. And what makes these known unknowns pernicious is that despite knowing what we don't know, we still can't get the data we want. We can't overcome our own ignorance. And what makes these particularly pernicious is that there's dire social and ecological consequences that emerge due to our inability to overcome our own ignorance. Again, despite us knowing that we don't know information and that we want that information, we can't find it. So that is the type of kind of not knowing, form of not knowing I'm going to focus on today. So with that in mind, I'm going to skip through this. These are other types of knowledges that I talk about in my paper, but let's just jump into the coronavirus. So the emergence of a pernicious known unknown. So I'm going to ask that you just follow the slide from left to right. Okay, so early in the pandemic timeline, there was considerable agreement from the scientific community that more knowledge via testing was necessary to flatten the curve. And yet, despite these warning signs, and yet despite these calls for more information, more data, more testing, for weeks and even months, there was a lack of testing. This is like in February, early March. And without this testing, hotspots and warm spots were very difficult to detect. Contact tracing and modeling the spread of the virus was really difficult without these tests. And as one advisor to the World Health Organization put it, you can't stop it if you can't see it. Okay, so what may be some of the factors that led to this lack of testing, lack of knowledge, and the persistence of this known unknown, right? Again, this idea that we want information, we want more testing, but we can't get it. And there are many reasons and explanations beyond what I'm going to present here, but we may categorize some of these hurdles under the topic or area of regulatory hurdles. So first of all, as many of you are aware, commercial and clinical labs could not conduct tests early on if they didn't have FDA, CDC approval. And for those labs that wanted to get approval, there was a very slow and complex application process, which slowed down the ability for these labs, private, non-governmental labs, to conduct tests. And even in instances where studies had been conducted, right, and there were swabs sitting there ready to be tested, they could not be tested without FDA approval, right? So these are all factors, regulatory factors, that prevented early testing from occurring. Another area of that led to a lack of testing were technical difficulties. So some of the early CDC tests were inconclusive due to some problems that occurred in the sequencing of measurements of data. So some of the assays were not conducted properly, or the equipment wasn't right, and so there's inconclusive results from those tests. There were also equipment, so personal protective equipment shortages, staff shortages, right, availability of nurses and doctors, and of course there were also funding limitations that prevented us from doing the number of tests we wanted to do. So that's another area that led to a lack of testing. And then another area is inconsistent leadership. So near the beginning of the outbreak, there was sort of what I'm describing as an economy first outlook. And by that I mean that statements were made that seemed to question whether or not it was worth taking this virus seriously. So statements were made such as by the president, for example, that we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. And the implied meaning here is that we cannot allow the economic consequences of responding to this virus be worse than the problem itself. Right. So this all suppressed urgency by kind of questioning whether or not we have to take this seriously. A second area related to leadership was questions around political expediency. And so early on, this was described as a political hoax, which again, for some governors, some leaders, this prevented them from acting quickly and doing more tests. And in general, there was a distrust, there has been a distrust in science, I would argue, for many members of the administration. So early on, despite evidence suggesting that the coronavirus was more contagious, more deadly than the common seasonal flu, comparisons to the flu still persisted. Again, suppressing urgency to do more testing. The language around the coronavirus for many leaders, mayors, governors, they've referred to the coronavirus as an invisible enemy. And so when I see that, I think, okay, well, that may be something that they're using this idea of an invisible enemy as a form of political cover so that they can't be blamed, right? If there's not enough testing or if the virus spreads rapidly and lots of people get sick, look, it's invisible. You know, we couldn't see it, right? But of course, that's the problem, right? It was invisible. Its invisibility is the problem that I'm arguing here, right? We should have had more testing so we could have made this virus more visible early on. Okay, so moving quickly forward here, this is a timeline of tests for COVID-19 amongst different countries. And if you look at this chart, and of course this ends April 6th, but if you extend it to May 1st, the United States looks quite good in terms of the number of tests that have been conducted, right? We have many, many more, millions of more tests than most other countries. And so this looks like a really positive trend in testing. And, oh, am I over 10 minutes already? Well, I don't know. Okay, well, I'll just wrap up quickly. This trend is something that was shown in many of the press briefings. Of course, we don't have those anymore, but again, a positive story seems to be told. However, I would argue that if you look at the response to the coronavirus, we initially started with a 15 days to slow the spread on March 15th. On April 1st, all of a sudden that became 30 days to slow the spread. The idea here is that we've sort of been moving the goalposts, right? And I think this is because we had to shift from 15 to 30, which actually is a total of 45 days, in part because we were behind the curve, right? By the time we started conducting tests, the horse was out of the barn, the train left the station, and we were stuck behind the curve trying to catch up. So I will just, kind of the final slide here, I will just say that if you look at this chart, number of COVID-19 deaths, COVID-19 tests, excuse me, per 1,000 people, you see that the yellow line, the United States, early during the pandemic was far behind other countries in terms of the number of tests that were being conducted, right? And so this is the problem I'm pointing at. We couldn't see the virus because we weren't testing for the virus. And as I've described, lack of testing meant lack of knowledge, which meant lack of progress, right? And these hurdles were regulatory in nature, technical and political. And that these delays in testing meant the virus early on spread unseen. And that this is despite scientists and most politicians wanting more data and more tests. And this is precisely what makes these pernicious known unknowns all the more frustrating, right? We knew what we wanted, scientists were calling for more tests, but yet because of some of the factors I described here, we weren't able to do more tests, and the virus has spread very rapidly in the United States. So I'm going to end there, and I will just give this prompt for discussion later by saying that given systemic failures regarding the coronavirus in the United States, what can we do? I'm speaking now to the audience here in this forum. What can we do as scientists and science advocates to help overcome pernicious known unknowns in the future, whether they relate to health, environmental issues, or other things? What can we do to slow down this pernicious known unknown? So with that, I will stop and pass it on to the next speaker, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Gregory. Our next speaker is Amanda Weaver, who is discussing surplus and scarcity food distribution during the COVID-19 epidemic. Just to keep us moving along, Amanda, I will unmute myself and give you a verbal note when we hit 2 minutes.
Okay, that would be great. Okay, can everybody see this? Surplus and scarcity?
Yes.
Okay, great. I do want to promise, and Peter can tell you that I actually gave him the name of this before all of the news came out this week about the food supply. I thought it was very interesting this week that we heard things like the food supply is broken. The CEO of Tyson Foods got on and basically took out a one-page ad in a major newspaper and explained that the food system is broken. And you've probably been hearing things like they've been dumping milk and euthanizing pigs on one side, and on the other side, of course, we have the scarcity that we've seen in the grocery stores. And I kind of wanted to try and make sense of this in 10 minutes. And so this is going to be from an economic standpoint. And as you all know, it's been pretty crazy economically for the last couple of weeks and couple of months here. So in the food system, what happened? A demand shift happened in the food supply chain. Okay, very simply. In this country, we have a huge service economy, and it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that we go out to restaurants a lot and we don't cook at home. And that shift basically flipped overnight. And you can see, this is actually from some of the articles that came out this week, the shift from grocery from restaurant sales. You can see how negative those restaurant sales are. And basically what happened is we all went home. And we all bought food at the grocery store that was shelf stable because we didn't know when we were going to be able to leave our homes again, or it was going to have to be very carefully. And you had a panic ripple through the economic food supply chain, which is just fascinating to me. And I'm happy to sort of post these graphs later. But you can see radically a shift. However, economically, restaurants and grocery are not perfect substitutes, meaning that you can't substitute one for the other and just have this nice demand shift switch from one thing to another. What happens is that it's actually an imperfect substitute because restaurants have higher demand for transportation, meaning trucking and delivery. They have higher demand for fresh foods, actually, than we do in grocery, as consumers do in grocery. Think of meat in restaurants and think about how many times you go out to eat seafood versus making seafood at home. So think of all those fresh things you get in a vegetable in a restaurant. But also the story about milk being dumped was around institutions like schools. You have to remember that there's been lots of supply of dairy and other foodstuffs into institutions like schools, and all of a sudden all the kids in our country and other countries went home. And so there was no place for dairy farmers to quickly shift and put that milk. The last reason that it is different and an imperfect substitute is because there are different commercial supply chains. So companies like Cisco and US Foods, they don't supply consumers, though, however, they have shifted in the last 2 weeks, and Cisco is now supplying majority frozen food into the grocery store market. The top and bottom of all of this is, and this is very counterintuitive, I think, for what's happening. The result is that food prices actually went down. And you can see on this graph here that slowly, sorry about that, that slowly, I'm moving the pictures of you all out of the way so I can talk about the graph. Food prices, meaning food prices going back to farms, have slowly eked down because that demand for restaurants was so high. This just gives you a really good idea of the idea that they are imperfect substitutes. Grocery hires versus restaurant layoffs. So restaurant layoffs were in the 8 million. Now this is not comparing food sales, but it just gives you an idea of the labor force versus the amount of people who were then rehired or hired by grocery industry biggies like Instacart, Walmart, Amazon, Kroger, Albertson, and Whole Foods. Actually, Sprouts is on there as well, which I found that interesting. So how else has COVID-19 affected the industrial food supply chain? And I say industrial here because we're going to talk about a couple different kinds of food supply chains that we have, because we have shorter ones as well. On the labor side, you have another interesting graph here, and we're going to talk about slaughter of meat in a second. But on the labor side, fruits and veggies are mostly picked by immigrants, and a lot of those people were staying home or sick. And so that's a big impact to the food supply chain as well, when most of your fruits and vegetables are picked by people who potentially may be getting sick. Transportation bottlenecks for the same reason. But the big one, and I found this fascinating, is that it's not a supply issue. It's actually much of a transportation. It's a bottleneck in distribution. So processing facilities, and that's another word for slaughter plant, have had to close due to sickness. And so when we look at slaughter plants, why is that important? Because meat is planned out. So if I am a hog farmer, I am growing piglets for 6 months. At 6 months, those animals have to go to market. If they don't go to market, then I'm paying extra to feed them, and I'm actually losing money per pound to keep those animals alive. And so what is happening right now, and you can see in this graph, I'm going to move the pictures again, is that we have a drop in slaughter of chickens and hogs and cattle because those facilities have had to close. So the result of all this is that farms can't get food to market, and there's low prices. And ironically, this has caused an entire supply shift down, because most recently farmers have made decisions, and again, this is in our industrial supply chain because it's so long and requires all these touch points, to not raise as many pigs. And there was a story about euthanizing piglets across the nation because they have to get to slaughter so quickly. So, sorry, I'm going to move the pictures one more time. So there are some winners in the food supply chain shift that has happened since COVID-19. And that is that we have shifted to processed food and to local food. The things that we have bought, and you can see from this graph, the dollar sales, and it spikes the week of March 16th. Beans, is that 5 minutes or 2 minutes or done?
2 minutes left.
Okay, all right. You can see that eggs spiked if you tried to find eggs, but also beans and dry pasta. So think of all the things you tried to look for in the grocery store. That's because everyone else was buying those things. And while there was a temporary blip in supply, we had all those things coming to market. It just wasn't ready for the spike. Now, interestingly, though, what I told you about the other fresh foods, that is due to that restaurant supply inequality that I talked about. So why is processed and fresh local the winners in all of this? Well, processed food, and I'm going to call processed food things that are shelf stable or frozen. They're simply not as prone to the demands of fresh food distribution. They can be stored longer. So we have stockpiles, literally, of dried products and of frozen foods. And one of my questions that I'm going to ask you in all of this is this a permanent move from the shelf, from the fridge? Because we slowly, over the last 20 to 30 years, have been moving all of our food products into the fridge. And the second thing, and it's exciting for local farmers, is that the short supply chain of fresh local production, so that's vegetables, meat, dairy, and eggs, despite historic barriers to the market, like less convenience because you're picking it up at the farm, and higher prices because it's produced at a smaller scale, consumers have been going to these places in droves and buying out local sales. So it's a very interesting time of that surplus and scarcity.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. I'm really looking forward to the discussion part at this point. I'd like to hand the mic to Ann Chin and Kelsey now, whose presentation is entitled COVID-19, Why is it an Anthropocene problem and what does it mean for ecological sustainability?
Great. Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Gregory and Amanda. So Ann and I started talking about the idea for this short presentation about a week ago, and it really came out of the previous panel and some of the interesting ideas that came up there. Specifically, we were really intrigued by the idea that was presented in the previous panel that pandemics might be a new facet of the Anthropocene. And this is a really intriguing idea because the concept of the Anthropocene really comes from geology initially. And so it's intriguing to think how that concept could be related to the pandemic in the conditions we're seeing now. And so we were interested to explore this a little further. So Ann, I was hoping you could start us off by just telling us, what is the Anthropocene? And I think your mic might be muted still.
Oh, sorry about that. So is that better?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, so yeah, so there does seem to be some confusion with respect to the use of the term Anthropocene, and so it does seem helpful to clarify a bit. So in fact, researchers have suggested using the big A in the Anthropocene to refer to the proposed new geologic epoch, signifying human influences on the planet, and the little a in the Anthropocene to refer to general environmental changes and conditions on Earth and to issues of sustainability. And we also see the word in quotes a lot, which is how I tend to write it. It was Crutzen and Stormer in a brief commentary in the year 2000 who suggested that Earth is moving out of its current geological epoch and that human activity is largely responsible for its exit from the Holocene. That is, humankind has become a global geological force in its own right. Well, this is quite an alarming idea because we've been in the Holocene for some 12,000 years. And in fact, changing the geologic timescale is a very big deal. And it involves many stages of review within the International Commission of Stratigraphy, and it can take a very long time. Currently, we're still in the beginning stages of the process of collecting evidence in developing the proposal for a new geologic epoch of the Anthropocene. Regardless, there's no denying that humans have changed the face of Earth. We're living in an everyday Anthropocene, the small a, which is a big deal too. All we have to do is to look around us to see examples and scales of human interactions with Earth systems, not least the process of urbanization. Well, scholars of Anthropocene have tracked a lot of these examples and changes, and they've noted the exponential increases in just about everything anthropogenic since about 1950 or so, in a period now known generally as the Great Acceleration. We see here human population, the damming of rivers, water use, fertilizer consumption, and even the number of McDonald's restaurants globally, perhaps an indication of our increasing global reach. And we see the same trends in other aspects of the ecological footprint. Increases in CO2 and other greenhouse gases, ozone depletion, and we can come down here. Increases in the loss of tropical rainforests, increasing domesticated land, and loss of global biodiversity. These are trends that perhaps we know well, and of course, some of us work on various aspects of these issues. So now getting to COVID-19 and pandemics, they too seem to show the same increasing trend in frequency, matching the time frame of the great acceleration of the Anthropocene. So Kathy, I want to ask you, I was wondering, so is this coincidental, do you think? Is there a direct linkage? And what's the deal? Can you give us some insight from the perspective of ecology?
Great, thanks, Anne. So in looking into this issue a little bit, we have uncovered that there are researchers researching this and have some really interesting results. So here we're looking at a figure from Allen and colleagues where they've created a model to look at what factors are related to emerging infectious disease events globally. And they've broken down these factors into 3 different categories: those related to human activity, animals, and the environment. And in this graph here, we're looking at the relative influence of these different predictors. The key thing to look at here is that the human predictors are what are shown in red here. And in the top predictors of these emerging infectious disease events, a large proportion of them are actually related to human activities, human population, the area of cultivated or managed lands, pasture, crops, and urbanization. And so this study really quantitatively links human activities, these same types of human activities that we see evidence of in the Great Acceleration, links these activities also to emergent infectious disease events in a really quantitative nature. And Anne, if you could move to the next slide for me. The exact links between these human activities, human footprint, and emerging infectious disease events is still not entirely understood. And in this conceptual diagram here, the authors were making this point by showing we know that human ecology is interacting with wildlife host ecology in some way with these human activities. But the exact mechanism, in this case they were exploring, is this an issue where people are in contact with more microbial diversity, or are human dynamics changing the dynamics of virus transmission within wildlife? We don't know the exact mechanism, but what's clear from these paired studies and this ongoing research is that there are clear quantitative links between these human activities related to what we see in the Great Acceleration and these emerging infectious disease events globally. So, Anne, I was curious, in the light of this really strong quantitative link, were you surprised to see this?
Well, I guess it was yes and no. I guess no, because by now, because of all of our discussions, I was generally aware that pandemics relate to the human interactions with animals and generally with ecological instability. But I guess I'd have to say that I was a little bit surprised that the quantitative linkages seem so direct and clear, actually, with respect to the environmental drivers, like the tropical rainforests and land use changes and that sort of thing. So I guess I'd have to say that I was a little bit surprised about that there are these specific factors and variables that we can point to. And that led me to wonder too, what this means going forward for us, what this means in terms of human environmental sustainability, and what's the significance of these findings. So Kathy, I want to turn the question back to you. What do you think? Do you think these findings are significant? And what do we take from this?
The thing I have found most interesting about, especially about looking at this really quantitative evidence of these linkages, and specifically what human activities are being related to these emerging infectious disease events, a lot of these are the same factors that we see that are responsible for climate change and for other large-scale global issues that we're dealing with. And so the question that it brings up in my mind is potentially the idea, if we see some overlap in these broad-scale global drivers of things like climate change and potentially in things like emerging or resurging infectious disease, are there potential overlaps in solutions or strategies to address these going forward?
Great, great. So yeah, initially at this point we were going to do a poll with with everyone, with the audience, but it turns out even with Kathy as a co-host, she's not able to set up a poll to stimulate discussion. So yeah, so I guess if this is the discussion period, I guess we could ask or start discussion if this is
Sure.
period. But again, initially we were going to do a poll, a very simple poll through Zoom.
Well, we could. Is it a simple poll with a yes or no response?
Yes, two yes/no questions.
Okay, well, let's give it a shot, and I'll ask everyone to raise your hand in response to whatever question.
Oh, so, okay, so this is just raise hand, right? So if I stop, you mean just raise hands? Okay, yeah, just raise hands?
Yeah, and through the sort of hand-raising function in Zoom, we can count that way.
Okay, so Kathy, you want to go ahead? You got the question. Question number one, ready? This is audience participation here, very easy.
Yeah, so we wanted to turn over the same questions that Ann and I just asked one another to the whole group. And so first, we were curious to hear if folks were surprised to see these really quantitative linkages between human activities and emerging infectious disease. Like Ann said, in a conceptual sense, it is.
I guess it's not just can I add? It's not just human activities, but it's the environmental drivers as well. The environmental drivers, right? Just all of it linked in a. It was a machine learning regression model. Actually, it was very high tech, quantitative.
Okay, so if you were surprised, then raise your hands now, and I will count.
Oh, so okay, so Rudy's raising this way.
Okay. So not too much surprise, it looks like. I see one hand raised and then Rudy. So do you want to go ahead and ask your next question, Kathy?
Yeah, and then the next question was again, we were curious to hear if folks also think that knowledge of this quantitative link is significant for us in terms of building strategies and solutions going forward.
Unfortunately, I can't raise my hand because I'm the host, but I'll add that.
Oh, okay. I didn't mean to clap. I meant to. How do you rate? Okay, I didn't mean to clap. Okay.
Yeah, but it's at the bottom of your participant list. If you click on the ... I believe you should see an option to raise your hand, and it's good practice because we'll use this in our discussion as well in just a minute. So I'm going to call that at about 28 or 30 raised hands out of 41 participants in total. Pretty good. Okay, so please go ahead and lower your hands. I'm going to introduce us to the discussion section, but I want to try a real quick experiment, which also requires audience participation, if you could bear with me. I would like to request that everybody please unmute your microphones. I'll just give it a second for everyone to unmute. Excellent. Now let's give our presenters a round of applause. Okay. Thank you so much for presenting. I think that this is really interesting stuff, and I think it really does an excellent job of sort of demonstrating not only the breadth but also the value of geography. I was chatting with some of the deans the other week, and we were thinking about some of this, and we're talking about enrollments. And, you know, I told them, I was like, you know, following this pandemic, hopefully a lot of people will start to see the importance of geographic perspectives. And I think they appreciated that. Certainly after this pandemic is over, there is so much work. It will take our discipline, and I would say the academy in generally, but I think especially geography, a long time to sort of unpack everything that's going on. And I say that not only as a health geographer, but I mean, I think we can see how this applies to so many of the fields that we think about as geography. So moving forward into the discussion period, I'd like to request that you use that hand raising function if you have a question. One of the convenient features of that is that it very conveniently queues everyone up in order. And just to keep it organized, I'll sort of play host and call on people to speak in order of their hand raise. If you are shy and don't want to speak, and I appreciate that applies to, or you don't have the ability to, or it's too noisy or anything, please feel free to type your question into the chat and I will read those to our speakers. And so with that, we've got a good half hour set aside for discussion, and I'd like to see if you've got any questions. And since I don't see any yet, I will start with a question I had. And this goes to Gregory. You had mentioned that you know, you were kind of grappling with the issue of uncertainty, and at some point I believe you mentioned sort of knowledge suppression with political motives. My question is whether through this work you have identified or whether you're aware of any kind of organized efforts to control the narratives around COVID-19. In other words, have we seen any examples of special interest groups organizing to control the narrative one way or the other, as we would normally see during a political season, for example?
Okay, so yes, I'm going to answer that. I just want to indicate that I did raise my hand. I don't know if you're getting that. You said no one had raised. That's okay. Just checking. But to answer your question, so I gave the one example. I was really surprised to see in the state of Florida that there are efforts to limit the ability of coroners to release the cause of death for people brought into their offices beginning a couple of days ago. And I don't know what the rationale is for that. There may be a good reason for that, but my initial look at that is, I'm sort of questioning that. Because it will skew the numbers in terms of how many deaths are affiliated with or associated with the COVID-19 virus. So that's one example I kind of brought up. I'm not really aware in this case of, in terms of, because I think the specific, to make your question even more specific, is in what way is the availability of data or of the enumeration and collection of data influenced by special interest, right? Trying to control the narrative. Because I think there's clearly efforts to control the narrative simply at the political level in terms of discourse and rhetoric. But in terms of controlling the flow of data and information, I kind of use the case of Florida as an example. I think there have been some examples from other countries where some of the data on the number of illnesses and the number of deaths associated with COVID-19 is highly questionable. And so then I don't, but again, I don't know the specifics of what office and, what head of what department is sitting there sort of overseeing that and not allowing certain data to get out. I do think, though, that much of the underreporting of the impact of the coronavirus in terms of number of cases, which actually might therefore reduce the death rate, mortality rate associated with it, is due simply to the lack of testing. I think that there are a lot of countries around the world that just are not testing, and therefore we just don't have a full grasp of how many people are ill and how many people have actually died from the coronavirus, right? We just don't know.
Thank you very much. And actually, you're the next in the queue. I see my hands now.
Okay. So I wanted to thank both Amanda and Kathy for your presentations. They're really interesting. And actually, my question is for, and I guess comment is for Kathy and Anne. I'm really happy that you brought this up. I think this is really important. Of course, my take on it is slightly different than what you presented, but I think it aligns with it really nicely, which is very early on in this pandemic, it became very apparent to me, and I think to many of us, that what we understood as a social problem, right, the pandemic, the health risks, immediately it became apparent to me that this is connecting this immense health human risk problem with ecological crisis, right? Because it became clear, and we don't really know the exact source of like the transmission of how this virus kind of leaked and got out and spread around the world. But people are pretty sure, and maybe I'll ask Peter, who's the health geographer here. I think though there's fairly high confidence that the origins are from species that existed in forests like bats that were disrupted, right? Their habitat has been disrupted over the course of the last 100 years, 10 years, and today, increasingly so. And that has led to this kind of spillover of these pathogens and other things from these, like a bat to the human population. Now, the exact connection is kind of difficult to trace at this point, but I just think that this is really a great presentation to make the point that what we understand as a social crisis is actually very much tied to the broader ecological crisis around the globe, and we really can't separate the two out, right? This is case in point, these two are closely linked together.
Yeah. Okay, so that was my surprise. I mean, I did not mean, so I don't know if everyone thought, or the question about the surprise is linking the human activities. It was more the environmental factors and the environmental drivers and the environmental mechanisms and origin that surprised me. And the data that Kathy showed earlier, the greens, the environmental factors, they were actually forested regions, forested tropical regions, land use changes and agriculture, and areas with high species richness, mammals with high species richness. So if we put those three together, and that's why I guess and then if we put the human stuff together, like the high population density and urban and so forth, that would be why we see a lot of the origins of these in the developing countries, in the tropical developing countries. So again, it was the environmental drivers that, for me, was sort of the take home and surprising message with the study, with the quantitative studies, and less so the population and the urbanization and those the human activity ones.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a really good point.
Thank you very much. Next in the queue is Connie Hickman.
Who's trying to get unmuted. My question is for Gregory, but maybe other people can jump in also. I run several errands that involve going into a certain pharmacy near a hospital. And I was talking to the lady in the pharmacy, and we were talking about the reporting of deaths of COVID-19. And this is kind of like, I guess you could say, hearsay coming out of support personnel at the hospital. And it's not just one hospital, but apparently several. But they say that they've been instructed by the CDC to follow a certain guideline for reporting COVID deaths, that if they don't have confirmation that it was COVID, but the symptoms fit, that they're supposed to report it as COVID. And also that if the person has another health condition, for instance, if they have terminal cancer, and they die and they test positive for COVID, that they're supposed to put COVID and not cancer. And I'm really simplifying this quite a bit because there's probably a lot more to doing a death certificate than I know. But I just wonder if you've heard anything that, according to the discussion I was having with this lady, her and a lot of the support personnel felt that there's maybe some reporting of deaths to COVID that really aren't due to COVID. But I said something like, well, that's sort of unethical. And she said, well, it's kind of disgusting because apparently the hospitals and other medical facilities will get more money from the government if it's a COVID death. So I think that's another whole can of worms, but have you heard anything like that?
I am unfamiliar with that. And maybe I'll defer to others who have a better sense of the, death, kind of this death certificate, filling out the death certificate by the coroner's office in the hospitals and the process that goes into that. I don't know. Peter, do you have any?
I haven't heard a lot about reporting, but I mean, I know that there has been some work to sort of systematize how they collect data on this. And I think part of the motivation is that they want to make sure that they are producing a correct count. So, this has happened several times throughout the pandemic where various states, you might recall a couple of weeks ago, New York added 3,000 to their death count because it's, especially with testing sort of, being complicated and there not being enough tests available. And certainly with them having a much higher rate of death than they would normally expect. So in the case of New York, they were able to basically say, look, on a normal year, we'd have X number of deaths, and clearly there's a lot that's going on unaccounted for because they had like 3,000 deaths beyond what they would expect in a normal year. And so they started counting suspected cases of COVID. And I think that in this case, I don't know, I'm sure there's some federal funding tied to it, but I know that there are a lot of people really interested in trying to get a more accurate count in a situation where there is an awful lot of uncertainty about what we don't know. I'm not surprised about the decision to kind of trump, based on how I understand death certificates work. If COVID's sort of the immediate cause with a bunch of underlying factors like cancer, that it makes sense to me that they would record it as.
I will also just say that if there was, up until now and even now, if there was more testing available, this wouldn't be up to question, right? We would just test the person who's sick and know, okay, well, they have cancer, but they also have coronavirus. But the lack of testing made it such that we're doing maybe a bit of a guessing game, or having to just look at symptoms and infer the virus from that. So
well,
I mean, and in terms of epidemiologic control, it's absolutely critical that we have as good an idea of the number of cases as possible. I mean, that absolutely drives so many decisions about controlling outbreaks and sort of balancing, easing the restrictions and all this other business too. So, people are very motivated.
I need to add one thing, though, that from what I'm reading, there are some people who don't show any symptoms and technically really don't get very sick from this. So it's possible that there is a certain group of people out there who might fit that criteria and then go to the hospital and have a heart attack and would test positive for COVID, but actually never really had the symptoms. So I think there's kind of like a dilemma there a little bit. Like, did COVID contribute to this death, or is COVID something that maybe some people can kind of carry around and not get terribly sick from? It's kind of a strange disease, I think.
Yeah, it is a strange disease. And I would say that those cases are all things considered of, people sort of who would die regardless of a COVID infection. I would say those are pretty rare and wouldn't have a huge impact on the numbers. There's definitely a problem with us completely not detecting cases. It was a week or two ago. New York seems to be doing an awful lot. They did a close to random sample. So they took 3,000 active people and just tested them for antigens, which is the test is a little questionable. There's fairly high false positive and false negative rate, but they estimate that in contrast to what the confirmed figures report, which is around 3, at the time anyway, was around 3% of the population of New York being infected, that the true figure is probably around 10 or 15%. So we're much further along the epidemiological, sort of the epidemic curve than you would think based on the popular media. Thank you.
Dr. Anthropocene, you inadvertently muted.
I'm sorry. I just said next in the question queue is Alex, and then we'll follow up with Rudy, who has given me a verbal hand raise.
I'm muted. Okay. Yeah. So I guess my question goes more to Dr. Weaver about the increase in demand for that the local food supply chain is experiencing. And I just wanted to kind of know if you know, like, how are they responding to this increased demand? Are they like, what methods are they like doing in order to supply more food, or are they feeling completely overwhelmed?
Both, actually. That's a great question. Well, I'll tell you, today at the farm, it's an online market that will happen through several producers, and then it will be all delivered or picked up next week. So what you're seeing is a really interesting switch. I mentioned at the last thing that I was talking about in the 10 minutes that I had was that people were willing to do more things to get those local products, because before you go to the grocery store, it's great if it's Colorado grown, but now people are seeking out locally produced food. And you're also finding that producers are seeing the market, and they're willing to deliver more. They're willing to do curbside pickup. They're willing to sort of look at these things because people are now interested in local food. And it's and while it's always been it's a niche thing, it's gone very popular in the last 4 weeks. So the demand has been incredible and overwhelming both. And what I'm seeing with other farms, including my own, is that we're very, very quickly trying to adjust to watching what other local retail models are doing, like curbside pickup, like things like that, so how we can respond to the market. And the big question for me is, will people stay? Or will they go back? What's our norm now? Did that answer your question, Alex?
Yeah, that was good. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to like insert my own question here, but it's going to be really interesting to see how the prices, demand, and supply kind of work themselves out on the other end of the deal, as well as we sort of move into restaurants. So more restaurant foods. There might be a price increase. Sorry, I had to.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we are going to see price increase, not necessarily on the farm end, but what we're seeing in local production is that people are not surprised by what the slightly higher prices of local have been, because now grocery stores are catching up and even surpassing what the local food price is. And just to give you an example, as a producer, my costs haven't gone up, so I don't need to increase my prices because my supply chain was already short. I'm not suffering, nor or other local producers, unless you happen to be a meat producer, in which case you might be experiencing a little bit of the problems with getting meat processed and things like that. But local prices are not going up, whereas I think you're right, you're going to see both restaurant and grocery store prices rise. So maybe it will be competitive with local and more industrialized food.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and pass to Rudy, who was giving me a verbal hand raise. You need to unmute, Rudy. If you hold the space bar down, it should unmute. You have to keep it held, though. Okay, so Why don't you work on unmuting, Rudy, and I'll go straight to Amanda's question. Oh, you're there. Go for it,
Okay,
Rudy.
yeah, good. I have a question for Amanda too. Thanks, Amanda, for pointing to these changes in the food supply chain and to our changing preferences, how we consume food now. I have a more hypothetical question. So we have seen the temporary closure of these meat processing plants. And so what would happen if we have half of them closed because of more fatalities? And do you expect changes in the food supply chain or in our practices of food consumption, our diets? What do you, if it happens that half of these larger meat processing plants can no longer serve the purpose?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting is you're seeing two differential streams, and I want to unpack, because there were actually two questions in there, and I want to unpack the first one, which is really, it took me a while to get my brain around it this week, is why are prices depressed around meat when the demand is so high? And it is because of this the distribution issue of the processing plants closing. Okay, when a processing plant closes, you essentially have meat production that can't get to market, and you've extended it out of a fresh product essentially. And so and those are USDA certified facilities, so it's kind of like a doctor's office or a hospital. Like you can't just you can't pop up another one. It is a very highly regulated process that, and some of them have been shut down because of COVID-related illnesses, and some of them have been shut down because the demand shifting from the ones that had shut down because of sickness and labor, we're now having to process the processing of that plant, and they ran out of freezer space and got shut down by the USDA because they had no place to store, because basically they're processing and then it's getting flash frozen and then it's going out into the marketplace, typically is how meat processing works. So when you have a real bottleneck like that, it's pushing prices down on the consumer end. But what I read from one economist is that in the long term, they're euthanizing pigs right now. So the supply of pork 6 months down the road is actually going to be less. They're doing that so prices stay higher for meat. It's kind of mind-bending, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did I?
Thank you. It might be a great time to think about vegetarianism. Amanda, it's your question. You had your hand raised, and you're next.
Sorry, I didn't know there. I have a student named Amanda too. I didn't know if she was out there. So I don't know if mine's a question, but it is to Kathy and Anne. I'm always fascinated with the fact that, so a couple of years ago, there was a bird flu that was affecting all of the egg hatcheries, and it was from this bird flu, which was in birds. It was killing off chickens, and so all of the chickens that were laying eggs had to be brought inside, so you couldn't have the free range and things like that. And even on farms where I keep my chickens outside, we had to be very, very careful, because any ducks or wild fowl flying over, if they pooped onto your chickens, there was a huge possibility. In fact, it wiped out egg sales across the nation about 3 years ago. And I'm always fascinated that, and we also know things like a lot of the world's major diseases came from this juncture, right, of human intervention called agriculture, living with animals, processing them, having, you know, I'm fascinated with the term of a wet market that we've been talking about, at least in the news in Wuhan, and what it is a farmer's market essentially, is what I understand. And so these crossovers actually happen quite a bit, not just in the forest, but I was just curious sort of how we bring these conversations sort of closer together, because I think about that a lot in the supply chain, as do just producers in general. And it's a really important thing that we be able to talk about them in these larger terms. And I just was curious if either of you wanted to comment on the fact that in an applied way, these connections are happening all the time. And this is one of the reasons the USDA and the FDA are very heavily involved in regulating farms. Yet I feel like we're not talking about it as a potential place where, and as we also know, bird flus and all of these other things are just sort of one layer away from moving into human populations. So I guess I'd like a comment on that. Sorry, I don't have a specific question.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Amanda. And I'm not sure I have anything specific to add other than to say that, like you said, these connections are really close, and this might be a good jumping off point. Our current situation might be a good jumping off point to really start a lot of those conversations while we sort of have everyone's attention.
Yeah, so if I can also add to that, I think one of the key points, perhaps, and key messages about being able to link these things, like the social with the environmental, with the everything, I think is the hope to try to address the issue earlier on, because look at what we're doing, right? Look at what we're doing. We're all needing to, I mean, not that they're not addressed earlier on, but I think the hope is to be able to get at the crux of the problem a little bit earlier on, so that we're not at the back end of it in terms of containment, the social distancing and then our quarantine, so that in the future we may be able to basically build capacity to address the nexus of all of these things earlier on in this, with increased understanding. That's, of course, what we hope. Not sure about the specific example of the bird flu and so forth, but I think overall that's, I mean, we have a lot of students in the audience, and then we each are working on our various aspects of the problem. But again, as students of the environment, and as, I mean, we're all students of the environment, that we hopefully will get into a better position in the future to be, again, to build capacity and to address the nexus of all these issues earlier on. And hopefully, I don't know, I mean, it's still coming, we know. I mean, yeah, the frequency of this, and how drastic and how quickly it gets around, how quickly it got out of China this time, for example. Yeah, and that the future generations will increasingly have to deal with this more than us. And so hopefully we can build capacity to do that with understanding the linkages and the different components there. And it's the same thing. And like Kathy said earlier, I guess that's the hopeful message. It's not a new problem. These environmental drivers are the things that we're working on anyway. But again, to understand that, to address the health issues, that we also have to address the environmental causes of it, and so forth. So that was hopeful for me to, when Kathy pointed that out to me in our discussions when we were preparing for this. That was hopeful for me. So I think that's one of the I guess the hopeful or upbeat messages that lessons that I hope we can take away from this.
Yeah, and I would like to just comment really quickly, and so we can get to the other questions. But this does make me think of the One Health perspective that I briefly mentioned last week that the WHO has sort of advocated years before this. The idea is that if we one of the best ways forward in terms of preventing or sort of reducing the risk for pandemics is to address the environment. The One Health perspective is this idea that pandemics, along with human health, is really inextricable from the health of the environment. With regard to all this stuff going on, my perspective is that sort of intact environments are often the result of a very long time where they have sort of developed a kind of stasis. You know, I think this is best exemplified by the fact that we have sort of endemic diseases for centuries, and the environment, the pathogens, the vectors, the people sort of develop a way to exist with it. And when it becomes a major problem, is almost always on the heel of some environmental disruption, you know, industrialization of agriculture, or in the case of Lyme disease, for example, the settlement of the Northeast. So my hope is that we can, that out of this One Health perspective will gain some ascendance, and people will start to sort of see the inextricability between these. Sorry for interjecting. Next question is Chris Christensen.
Wait, can I just, sure. Can I just add something there? Because before we just jump to the next topic, I just want to make, just adding to this conversation about sort of the interdisciplinary nature, right, of studying this pandemic and the importance of thinking about the environmental drivers, the human incursions and disruptions and how those connect. I just want to also make the point, because the wet markets were brought up, and I think there's still some question as to what role the wet markets of Wuhan played in all of this coronavirus pandemic. But generally speaking, we know that past viruses and the spread have in some ways made their way through these wet markets of other parts of the world. And I just want to make the point that one of the reasons why these wet markets, where they bring live animals in, store them, slaughter them in place, and then off goes the meat, you know, to various places, and the various, you know, vectors and blood and everything is sort of mixing in these markets. One of the reasons why they bring the animals in live and slaughter them there, and therefore you have these animals commingling in cages next to one another, is because these are regions in parts of Asia, parts of Africa, that lack the capacity to have enough electricity to support refrigeration. So the way you can't bring in the meat already slaughtered somewhere else and have it sitting out there in the hot sun all day, right? There's a lack of refrigeration, which means you have to bring in the animals live, slaughter them in place, which means they're, again, commingling. That's a development problem, right? That's a social consequence. So here we have these environmental disruptions, we have these environmental processes, these human disruptions, and this is all also tied together with development progress in other parts of the world, right? And these things all come together to influence the spread of these viruses between species and between species and humans. So I just wanted to make that extra point of sort of tying into this also the kind of human development component to the complexity of this problem.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was trying to push through there a little quicker than I should have probably. The next question goes to Chris.
My question is for Amanda. And there seems to be just the burgeoning part of a conversation of how we change our supply lines to make them more resilient. In terms of when a disaster happens, we're not dealing with a single supply line for food that's just to restaurants. What do you think the future of that looks like?
Well, I hope, well, that was sort of the question I left it with, right? Is what will be the new norm? I certainly think that and I liked Anne's, the hopeful things out of some of this. I think there are some hopeful things that we're all learning from this, is that it is good to continue to have some short supplies, meaning that you have local farms that can supply some amount. And the question is, how much? how much can local supply and how much do we want to have? When we think about, on the urban side, Chris, I know you and I talk about it a lot as far as like, as farms get pushed out with cities, right? It's less and less efficient to grow food in a place like Colorado, where water is so expensive. Yet, it is these local systems that have allowed people to continue to get meat and certainly other local resources during this pandemic. So I think the thing that's unfortunate about local systems is that oftentimes it's the burden on the producer when we talk about sort of equity across society for things like offering SNAP or I'm trying to think of food stamps. SNAP, is that the word I'm trying to think of?
Right.
It is more of a, like for a small producer like me, it's very, very burdensome because of the expense of the system of being able to get the card reading system as opposed to a large grocery store. So I think you're going to see some shifts in equity as far as access to what has traditionally been more expensive local food because of the smaller, the economies of scale of local food. I also think you're going to see us return to a little bit more diverse supply system, if that makes sense. So we have depended in the grocery store sector on the warehouse concept for food, which really makes us dependent on, well, to go back to some fun geography terms, break of bulk, right? Where do we have these break of bulk systems in transportation methods? And I think we're going to see some of those things change. And to go back to some retail theory stuff, I think we're going to see how we buy food change. I think this move to online and delivery is radically going to, doesn't that necessarily mean it's going to be better for the environment, which I think we all need to keep our eyes on. But the whole idea, Americans are obsessed with going to the grocery store and touching everything. That's not the case everywhere. And so I'm fascinated. I'm watching with bated breath to see what the new model is. What do you think?
I'm kind of wondering if it's going to change diet preferences. I'm always interested in advocating for vegetarianism. If that's actually going to move the dial.
I think we're going to have a whole colloquium on that one, on whether or not vegetarianism is actually better for the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
okay.
My thought on that, Amanda, to answer your question is, yeah, there's some built-in social inequity in local food. And you and I have had that conversation a lot. But there's gotta be a way. We're overly dependent, and I think this is where I think that needs to be changed, is everything's large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, and that's where I think there has to be some change, and that's a health reason as well. Mm-hmm. But even taking somebody like Cisco, mm-hmm. And the giant 40-pound can, right. It's like, is that a sustainable model for production if then that 40-pound can can't be used anywhere else? And so that's what I'm wondering is, and part of my question is, that's something that is going to need to change, or there's something in between?
I think you're going to see the market respond with some really interesting things dealing with just that. Because of, it kind of depends on how restaurants come back as well. But food sales to restaurant has fueled so much of our food supply. And you're absolutely right. And then consumers have followed with going to Costco and Sam's Club and buying commercially and in these giant quantities. And historically, we've followed suit with giant refrigerators.
Thank you. And I want to make sure we try to get to the last two questions before we run out of time here. Next is Giovanna.
Hi, sorry, I turned my camera. My question is also for Dr. Weaver. So you hinted at this a little bit before, but I was wondering, whenever we do kind of go back to like normal, when we start going to restaurants again, and if we go back to school, how bad the food shortage would be, since we've seen all the farmers have to resow their crops, and you said they're euthanizing pigs and other animals. When do you think we might start seeing that, and how bad you think it might be?
Oh, I don't have a crystal ball. I think you will be able to find the things that you want. But I think this is another silver lining. I think people will learn, rather than having the world is your oyster at the grocery store or at a restaurant, they will start to, what we've been trying to do in local food movements for a long time, which is get people to eat more seasonally, which is also more environmentally, because it means things, you use more of the animal, and you also have less transportation when you're eating more seasonally. So what I think you're going to see happen is, and this is what I was reading an article the other day from another economist, a food economist, and he was saying that the food will be available, but not all cuts and all the time. Does that make sense? So there will be vegetables, but it won't necessarily be that you can walk in at any point, like we have been able to previous to March 15th, and get blackberries from somewhere around the world, right? They call it the PGST, the Permanent Global Summertime, where you can go in and get avocados, right? It just switches the country that you're getting avocados from. I think we're going to see a bit of a change. And for those of us who are on the older end, rather than on the younger end of life, I grew up in northern Minnesota, where you didn't have, like, I didn't eat an avocado until I was 20, until I moved to a larger city and found this wonderful thing called avocados and salsa. So I don't think it's gonna, I'm not gonna predict that it's gonna be bad. I think it's gonna change the way we prepare food and the way we ask for food. And I think maybe our consumption, which I think we can all agree has gotten a little bit nutty. Is that fair answer? I mean, what do you think? I think this is all.
I think that's it would be great if we returned to seasonal foods. I mean, environmentally, it seems like that's addresses a lot of issues, doesn't it?
As long as I can have my avocados every day.
So Amanda, because we're moving to more seasonal food supply options, and I know that some organizations like Boulder County Farmers Markets are all going online and doing online ordering systems until the end of May currently. I'm wondering how that could affect, because seeing firsthand at the farmers market, some of the food gets wasted since they don't sell everything. Like green beans, sugar snap peas are sold immediately, but something like squash may not be. Do you think this will be better for farmers to be able to meter the supply that they bring, since they're not bringing like a show amount of food to markets?
Who is this? That's a great question.
This is Nicole Delana.
Oh, okay, thanks, Nicole. And actually, all the questions have been great. Yes, I mean, I was just talking about that today. So I am part of a consortium of producers and farmers, and we just launched an online market where people will order ahead. They'll order this weekend and they'll pick up next weekend. And so that in farmers markets are fun for consumers, not so fun for producers, because you take a bunch of things hoping you're going to sell it. And basically they go and sit in the hot sun all day. And so if you have vegetables, if you don't sell out of those vegetables, you're pretty much got to give them to the rest of your animals or compost them or throw them away. And so yes, I think this addresses, it makes everybody happy. And this is one of the things when I said, consumers are starting to do things that we could never expect them to do, like order ahead and tell us what they wanted. So yes, I think you've got your finger right on what's good for farming as well.
Thank you. And let's have our final question, and then we'll wrap up after we address this from Brian Wee.
Great, thanks, Peter. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you to everybody today. I always look forward to these very much. So this question is really for sort of a combination of Amanda, Kathy, and Anne, actually. And so Kathy and Anne, on your presentation, you had this slide where you looked at human sort of activities, and I think population was second from the top on that chart in terms of the impact of population as a sort of human activity. And this is interesting because I've often thought about the idea here, and Amanda knows about this, the idea that it's not that we don't have enough food to feed the population that we have in the world, is how resources, food resources in this context, is allocated and distributed. There's a lot of inequity there. But looking at the chart that you're showing, I wonder if there's more to it. Is it not only the fact that there is inequity in how resources are allocated and distributed, but are we truly seeing a real serious issue with overpopulation from almost sort of a Malthusian, from a Malthusian standpoint, where we're seeing sort of these preventative checks, as he would call it, showing up. Does this change the nature of that discussion?
Oh, well, I'll start out just because I want to point out something about that plot. Like Anne mentioned, that paper we relied on for this presentation is super dense work, and it wasn't. We couldn't get into a lot of the details, but the population thing is really tricky because that population that they're using as a predictor, actually areas of low population are where we see the transfer or the spillover.
Oh, okay.
And so that was not at all evident in the way I presented it, just because there wasn't time to get into all of that. So while urbanization and these other types of human activities, pasture land, agriculture, all of those are, the more activity is correlated with the stronger or more events. Population is actually reverse.
Okay, and so I want to thank once again the presenters and for their work. I thought that was really great. I also want to thank all of you for coming and turning this into a meaningful discussion. And I'll just conclude by wishing you all well. I hope you continue to kind of work through this situation well, and please stay tuned as we will email you about any other activities that we've got as we round out the semester.
I also like to thank everyone for coming. It's really great to be able to gather periodically like this. It really builds a sense of community, and at this time is just really important. So thanks everyone for coming and for interacting. I think and thanks Peter for continuing to organize and to host these. It's really great.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody.
All right. Well,
thanks Peter. Thank you everybody.
I hope I'll see a lot of you around.
Great
Take
job.
care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.
Hey, Chris.
I'll try that again. Hey.
Hi. So, why don't I go ahead? Oops, let me stop my recording.